Thank you for inviting me here today. I have been coming to Ventura County for 25 years, never been to Hueneme, so I'm very happy to be
Welcome.
today. Thank you. Thank you. I drove in from San Pedro, so coming through the farmland, oh, it's gorgeous. So today we're going to talk about Chinese abalone harvesting on the Channel Islands. So we're going to have kind of two parts of the presentation. The first part, I will talk to you about how the abalone was harvested, and in the second part, we'll talk about how Chinese merchants set up a global trans-Pacific network to get the abalone overseas. So several people ask me, why do I do this? I don't live here, I don't live in Ventura County. Why am I so involved with the Chinese? So I'll give you a little background on me, is that when I was at UCLA back in the 90s, I was doing my undergraduate work in the anthropology department, and there was a senior thesis that I was involved with. So many of my other fellow students were going all over the world, to study shaman or musical instruments in South America, but I'm a mom, so I needed to stay local. So I found that there was an archaeological excavation in Ventura, and it was Ventura's former Chinese community. So I went to the archaeologist and said, can I be involved? And she said, sure. So I got involved with that, with the Chinese in Ventura. And then right after I graduated, I was so sad because I had such a great time investigating the Chinese. And right about that time, my phone rang, and it was the archaeologist of the National Park Service, and said, Linda, we have evidence that there were Chinese abalone fishermen on the Channel Islands. Would you investigate it? So I said, yes, I would. So that was 25 years ago. So I've been working on this topic for 25 years. So at first what I did is I looked at it pretty much from a historical point of view, because I'm a mom, I have 4 boys. So I needed my youngest one to grow up. And it took him a really long time to grow up, 20 years. So as soon as he hit 21, I applied to grad school. So I went to San Diego State to get my master's degree, and I specifically went there because there's a professor there, Dr. Todd Brady, which had a relationship with the National Park Service, because it's difficult to get onto the islands and do work there. So that's a little bit about me. So let's get started. Oh, by the way, what you're going to see today is the presentation that I made to defend my thesis. So,
okay.
Yes, you shall. It's a little tiny bit academic, but we can do it. We're going to make it through it. Okay, so the Chinese that came to California came from Southeast Asia, and specifically from the Guangdong province. So it's this area here. And they came from about 12 districts here in the Guangdong province. Okay. So we do a little quick Chinese American history. Okay. So the first Chinese that came here to California came originally with the gold rush, of course, in 1849. And at first, they were pretty much tolerated in the mines. And then as time went on, they were seen as strange, as came from a different country, spoke a different language, wore different clothing, worshipped a different god. So there were taxes that were placed on the Chinese miners. It was called the Chinese miners' tax. So they were pretty much excluded from the mines. This is a theme, as you can see, is going to be happening throughout the presentation today. And then they set up laundries. Now, have you ever seen a Chinese laundry before? No? Well, they used to be in almost every city in the West. In Ventura, there were 5. So in other cities, there was as many as like 20, depending on how large the community was. So Chinese laundries were very popular, and they did a really good job. So while we look at this slide, I just want to let you know that in the Chinese culture, the last name is spoken first. So in this case, Yi is the surname. So in my case, I would be Bentz Linda. So you'll see that this happens throughout the presentation today. Okay. They also, of course, helped to build the western leg of the Transcontinental Railroad, which you see here. And they were also engaged in farming industry, as we see here in Ventura County. Okay. So the fishing industry started in about the 1850s, and the first fishermen that came here came from Monterey, came to Monterey. Now there's this family tradition that around I think there were two voyages, one in the 1850s, one in the 1860s. They were ocean-going junks that came out of China and landed both in Monterey and in Mendocino. So very early voyage of the Chinese. And they were fishermen. And so that's in the 1850s. So by the 1870s, you have fishing all up and down the coast. So we had the shrimp fisheries up in the San Francisco area. We had the abalone industry down in San Diego. And of course, we had the abalone industry on the Channel Islands. So as time was going on, the Chinese were definitely engaged in helping to build the infrastructure here. They helped build the Transcontinental Railroad. They helped to build the deltas up in the Sacramento area. But after the building of the Transcontinental Railroad, there was an economic downturn. Does this sound familiar? Economic downturn? There was an economic downturn around the 1870s. So the Chinese were accused of competing in the unskilled labor market. So they were excluded. So the Chinese were the first immigrant group to be excluded from America in 1882, and they were excluded continually until 1943 when World War II. So 61 years of exclusion. So the first act was passed in 1882, and it was mostly just the laborers. They wanted the laborers to be excluded, but they allowed merchants, travelers, students, and diplomats to come to America. Now you'll see how this is very important as we move forward in our story. And only merchants and natives, so if you were born here and you wanted to go back to China, you could bring your wife and children from China. Only this class is exempted class. And these are another series of laws that were passed, is that Chinese could not become citizens, they could not testify in court against Euro-Americans, they couldn't hold certain jobs, they couldn't own land, that's the Alien Land Law, 1913, and they couldn't intermarry. Okay, now we're going to Channel Islands. So, of course, there's 8 Channel Islands. They're in two groups. This, of course, is your northern group and your southern group here. So there were Chinese abalone fishermen on pretty much every island, because pretty much every island has been surveyed. The only thing is that we can't find evidence of Chinese abalone fishermen on Santa Barbara Island or Anacapa, but newspaper accounts tell us that they were there. So, has anybody been to all 8 islands?
No.
I'm trying really hard to go to all 8 islands, and I can get that T-shirt that says all 8. Yeah, I've been on 5 so far. 4? Good job. Yeah, because you've got San Diego. Yeah, San Diego, that's San
No, Catalina.
Catalina, yeah. Okay, also let's talk about Catalina. What we're talking about Catalina is that for my graduate studies, I looked at 5 islands where Chinese abalone harvesting was taking place. The only island we weren't allowed to get on was Catalina. So there's a huge hole in my study. But we couldn't get a permit. We couldn't get an archaeological permit. But we will. Even if I have to swim there, I'm going to get out there. I mean, I can go out there for free on my birthday. You know, you can do that. By the way, you can go out to Catalina free on your birthday. Yeah, out of San Pedro. But I have to stay out there for quite a long time to walk 26 miles around. Okay. Okay, so this is the result of the archaeological work that's been done on the northern islands. So San Miguel here, this was surveyed by my advisor, Dr. Sabraji. There are 22 Chinese sites there. This is Santa Rosa, of course, that we found 26 sites. So you can pretty much see how we surveyed this, is that we started here and walked around, and then it got real rocky here, so we weren't quite able to get there. And so there's 26 sites there, and then on Santa Cruz, there's only 14 right now, but that island's still being studied. And these are the southern sites, the southern islands. So San Clemente Island, 43 sites. It has the most sites of any of the islands. And San Nicolas Island has 39 sites. So these have all been surveyed and researched by archaeologists. Yes, sir?
When you find a site, what do you find?
Oh, wait for it. I'm going to show you in just a minute. Okay, so of course we're looking for abalone. So the population was in hyperabundance on the island. So the earliest abalone fisherman I can find, Chinese abalone fisherman, is on Santa Cruz Island in 1856. So you can imagine that the Chinese go out there to the islands, they see that the abalone population is in hyperabundance, and the Chinese love abalone. It's a delicacy. So they go out there and they see that that's out there, and they realize that they can set up this business and they can become rich, rich, rich if they harvest the abalone. So, of course, we know that the abalone is in hyperabundance because the predators, the otters, have been hunted out starting in the late 1700s, and Native Americans are taken off the islands in around the 1820s. So, lots of abalone out there. Okay. Oh, one thing I want to add. So, abalone, there's a difference between the meat and the shell. I mean, obviously, there's the meat, there's the shell. There's two different businesses for this. So the abalone was dried and sent overseas, and then the shells are used for like curios, like buttons or little glasses cases, or they can be broken up and used for lacquer work. So it's two different types of industry. So we know that the abalone shells started to be sent either back east or overseas around the 1850s or so. Okay, so here are some pictures of the people that were actually harvesting the abalone. So these men came from Santa Barbara. So you can see some of them have their affiliations. So the way that I have these pictures is that what happened with exclusion is that once we were an excluded class, if you wanted to go to China and return, which you want to do because your family's there, this is the male population who's here, is that you needed to apply for what we call a return certificate, which means you have to have this extensive investigation to see if you are qualified to go and come back. They wanted you to go, but you wanted to come back. So what I did is that I found all of these files in the National Archives in Paris, California now. Used to be in Miguel, now it's in Paris, California. So I found these Chinese fishermen and these files. It's amazing what's on the files. It tells you their villages, their districts where they came from, their date of immigration, even gives their height, their weight, the distinguishing marks. It's incredible, the information that you can glean off of these. So what's funny is that when I first started this, when I talked to other archaeologists that have worked on the islands, they said, Wendy, you are never going to find those files. No way in the world are you going to be able to find them. So it took me 10 years, but I did. I found them. So, and the only way that I did find them is that when I would go to the National Archives, I would just read immigration files for Yis and Jins because I knew that the population in Santa Barbara were Yis and Jins. Well, it turns out that the fishermen were not Yis and Jins. So in 1901, the sheriff went through the Chinese community in Santa Barbara. For some reason, someone asked him to do this, and he wrote down the names of everybody in the businesses, their actual names, and it turns out that it's mostly the Soon clan, the Soon and the Liu clan. So that opened up a whole world of discovery. Oops. Oh, wait, here we go. Okay, so how did the Chinese get out there? What they did is that they chartered vessels from local ship captains. So what you see here, I know it's hard to see, but it's an entire listing of the different vessels that were chartered by Chinese to take them to the islands between 1856 and 1913 when the harvest of abalone was outlawed. So I'll give you a couple of highlights here for you. So this is a Chinese junk right here, a couple of Chinese junks between 1879 and 1880. By the way, they were building Chinese junks in Santa Barbara. And here is an island transport vessel, okay, the Santa Rosa. And then here is the Reckless. Now the Reckless has a really interesting story in that they worked for the Chinese between 1894 and 1901. And in the National Archives, which is a treasure trove of information, the captain there, Captain Burtis, he worked with the Chinese for 7 years, and one round trip to San Clemente Island, he was paid $80 in 1896. So that's a lot of money in 1896. So it's a pretty complete list there's a little bit of a break for the Civil War, and basically when a vessel would either wreck or go out of the area, the Chinese would just charter with another vessel. This comes from newspaper accounts. Here it is. This is what it looks like out there. Okay, so there were two kind of camps. We have what we call base camps. So base camps are where they're living, okay? They're living, they're boiling the abalone, they're harvesting nearby. So this right here is one of the base camps, okay? There are also what we call processing camps, where they basically just harvest the abalone. They would shuck the meat out of it and then move on. So we're finding these different kinds of camps out on the islands. So this is at near Sandy Point. This is right near the wreck of the Golden Horn. The Golden Horn wrecked on Santa Rosa Island in 1892. So this is right near there. The neat thing about the Golden Horn is that it wrecked with a cargo of coal. So Chinese abalone fishermen who are out there and need fuel to fuel the coal ships are pretty happy about that. Oh my gosh, there's a whole ship of coal right up on the beach. And then here, this is at Brockway. That is a hearth. That is a hearth where they would boil the abalone. And then this is a site, this is definitely a base camp. There were two different areas here. This is as measuring it. So they were living there. You can see they're right by the rocky intertidal. So the Chinese only took black. They only took black abalone. They didn't die. They didn't die for the red. And they only took adults. They didn't take the babies, which is interesting. And then in some sites, we see just piles of wood that are piled up on the beach there. So they're kind of hard to see. I mean, as you're surveying, you need to be able to identify them. The main identifier are these black abalone shells, just laying around for a long time. Okay, so here's how they lived. So they either lived in tents, and the way that we know they lived in tents is that we found evidence of stakes and grommets and tent pads. They were dropped off for about 3 months or so. So they'd be out there, they harvest for about 3 months. They live in tents. In some cases, they live in actual structures. This is on San Nicolas Island, and we also know that they live in a structure on Santa Cruz Island at Forney's Cove. And they lived in caves. I love the story about caves. It's so funny, when my thesis was edited, all the editors wanted to talk about was Chinese living in caves. Tell us more about Chinese living in caves. So I'm going to tell you about it. Okay, so on Santa Cruz Island, on the east side, at Honeyman's Gulch, we found a cave complex that was occupied by the Chinese. So we think it was occupied by the Chinese, and this is archaeologists' problem, is that we found evidence, we found artifacts, but they weren't in the cave. They were outside of the cave. So they could have been washed out of the cave. We just don't know. But I'm going to say that they were there. There was also evidence that people had been there in the 21st century. We found a lot of like beer cans that were, mixed in with Chinese. Yeah, people like caves. Okay. On San Nicolas Island, and this is fascinating also. Do you know a story of the Island of the Dolphins, the little woman who lived on San? So she could live anywhere she wanted, but there was one particular cave which has been noted. Do you all know the story about how the cave was being excavated? Okay, that cave. Okay. So there's a cave there. It's on the west side, and right outside of that cave is a Chinese abalone camp. So very near the opening of the cave. And then here also on San Clemente Island, the Chinese lived in a cave there. And it was described in 1909 by Charles Holder, said that Chinese abalone hunters had made their headquarters near the cave. So I can't get them in the cave, but I can get them near the cave. So basically, I mean, whoever's been out there, it's windy. It's windy and it's cold. And, I would live in a cave too. I would live anywhere I could to get away from that wind. So they basically just took advantage of the environment. Okay, so here's how they processed the abalone. So when they went over to the islands, they probably, I can't say 100% of the time, but definitely part of the time, is they brought this little vessel called a sampan. So it was probably like drawn behind this schooner or sloop before it was up on the deck. But they would bring this, and they would either row along the rocky shorelines harvesting abalone with pry bars, or they would walk, okay? There's one spot on Santa Cruz Island at Forney's where you're up on a steep cliff and you can look down onto the rocky intertidal, and you can see, you can predict this, you can look down the coastline, is you can see little areas, little sandy areas where the sampan would land, okay? They would harvest the abalone, they would come up that cliff, they would shuck it off, get back in the sampan, and continue to go down. We found about 10 sites like that. So that was, it gets pretty good when you can predict it. You can predict what the Chinese were doing. So what they would do is they would harvest the abalone, they would shuck it, and then they would boil it in a giant cauldron like this. And they would boil it over these kind of hearts, these little stone hearts. They're hairpin shaped. So not only do we see these here on the Channel Islands, but we also see these up in San Francisco and in the Mother Lode. So some archaeologists say that they're diagnostic of Chinese sites. So this is actually Japanese workers that are on San Clemente Island, but that's the only picture of a cauldron that I have. So I think they all look alike. I mean, you can tell based on the size of the hearts. Okay, the artifacts. Ooh, everybody loves the artifacts. Okay, so here's something else that is diagnostic: is that the Chinese, in many cases, they weren't assimilating. They were continuing their food ways, their language, their culture. So they were having a lot of their food imported in. And they were brought in these brownware jars, these, in this case, really large brownware jars. So we find, if you find these on the islands, you have found a Chinese site. These are absolutely diagnostic. So what was in these jars, this right here is a soy sauce jar. That's a wine jar. We think that's a rice jar. These wide mouth jars have like pickled vegetables in them. So we find these all over the islands. In fact, it was the brownware jars we found outside of Hungry Man's Cave. So, okay, and then another really interesting thing is that these cut stellar sea lion teeth were found on San Miguel, and it was an entire processing sequence here. So they have the teeth, and then they would cut them down, and then they would end up with this beautiful little beveled ring. So these were found at a Chinese site, but not 100% sure if it was the Chinese that were working on those. The other thing that we find in Chinese sites are whale bones. So I'm not quite sure why we find whale bones, but they're pretty prevalent. Of course, we have the pry bar. This is more of these brownwares. We find rice bowls. There's only about 2 or 3 different patterns of rice bowls. The winter green, kind of a celadon, and then kind of a gray pattern with kind of splashes of dark blue. Those are called bamboo. And then we find other patterned rice bowls out on the island. And we also find evidence of opium use. So this is an opium can right here, and this is the top of a lamp. So we found this lamp right here came from Santa Rosa Island, and we found evidence of opium use also on Santa Rosa and on San Clemente. And this here is the pipe, and it has that little stamp on it, and that stamp says Firebird. So, had that translated. And then here is the sole of a shoe. So we found shoes on San Nicolas Island and on Santa Rosa Island. So, not a lot of artifacts, but we did find artifacts pretty much spread along the base camps. Okay, now, this is going to take a lot of explaining to explain it. So this is the abalone yield between 1879 and 1904. And this information comes from newspaper accounts and from the United States Commission of Fish and Fishery reports. So what happened is that the reporting is very uneven, okay? So in some years, as you can see here, they reported both the meat yield and the shell yield, okay? So that's meat and shell. And look at that, look at all that shell. Isn't that amazing? Remember, this is dried abalone. And then what they also did is in other years is they would report both the meat and the shell yields together, which makes it difficult for us to really understand. So I had some marine biologists look at this, and they say, well, Linda, it's obvious that they were depleting the abalone population, which it's difficult to tell because we don't have the yield here. So I've had many conversations with people as to if the Chinese were harvesting abalone in a sustainable fashion. Because we know they were only taking the adults. So that's still kind of up in the air, still up for discussion. Okay, so this gives you an idea of the different years of harvest on the island. So like we said, is that Santa Cruz was the earliest island, so they started there in 1856 and continued until 1913. The taking of black abalone was prohibited in 1913. So we have 57 years here, we have 56 years here. On San Nicolas, we started a little bit later, and they stayed for 28 years. San Miguel also started a little bit later, and they stayed for 38 years. And look at San Clemente. Isn't that interesting? So when I first started this, I always thought that the harvest on San Clemente, that the fishermen must have come out of San Diego. But we couldn't find them coming out of San Diego. But in the course of reading the immigration files, they were being harvested by the fishermen in Santa Barbara. So here's a couple of things that I'm really still thinking about, and I'm willing to take any ideas here because I'm still thinking about this, is that it was harvested for 6 years. It has the most sites and the most hearts. Remember when I showed you all the different sites that were there? Okay, they started ranching later than on the northern islands, and smuggling was suspected on San Clemente Island during this period, during like the 1890s or so. They were suspected of coming up from Mexico on ships and landing on San Clemente Island and then coming ashore. So that might have made it difficult to harvest abalone out there. We think that it's possible that there were only base camps, that they didn't do the logistical processing because there's very little water out there. So we think that they may have moved the base camps until the populations were depleted. But I don't know. 6 years of depleted population, I don't know. Because look at all these other years that they were out there. And the one thing is that San Clemente Island was the first island recorded by an archaeologist. So there were more sites because they erode over time. So that's interesting, isn't it? Okay, so here are our conclusions and discussion from just the harvesting, is that the islands closest to the mainland were harvested first, okay? So I spent the last year, I got a grant to investigate the Lone Woman on San Nicolas Island. So the grant was to investigate commercial activities that were taking place on the island between 1835, 1853, because I didn't think she was alone. I thought there were people out there with her, so I got a grant to try to figure it out. So because we had that evidence of a Chinese camp right outside the cave, okay, I thought, well, they're out there together. Yeah, the little woman's out there, friends with her Chinese friends are out there, everybody's out there. Well, couldn't do it. Couldn't find it. I did find a Chinese sailor on a vessel, the Abalone Liberator, in 1836, but I can't get him off the boat and onto the island. So that's what we're trying to do. But as of now, it is Santa Cruz Island was the first one harvested. As we said, the majority of the abalone harvested were adults. Fishermen may have alternated islands. They may have harvested certain islands and then moved to other islands. And that's why I thought that maybe San Clemente Island was picked up later, is that they needed to harvest there because they were depleting the abalone on the other islands. They used the available resources. They used the stone for the hearts. They used any buildings or caves there. They maintained their traditional foodways. They adapted to meet the unique challenges of various islands. And many of these have been destroyed due to topographic processes. So wind, wave action, pinnipeds, oh my gosh, elephant seal all over these archaeological sites. One archaeologist I know, he'll walk among them and he'll get mad at them and just take his hat off and hit them on the nose. Stop messing up the archaeological sites. So that concludes that part of the harvest. So maybe I'll take questions now because we're going to move on to a different topic in just a minute. So any questions about what we've talked about so far?
Okay, shells are durable, the meat is not. How did they, I mean, they had the boiling pits on the island, but how did they get the meat to any sort of market?
Oh, that's coming up. That's part 2. You guys are good. You're telling me what's coming up. I like that.
When you were gathering and looking for artifacts from the Chinese, did you find artifacts from the Indians?
Mhm.
Kind of
Yes.
Give me an example of what, because I imagine the Indians lived in the caves too,
Yes.
and how could you separate the two, or from one from the other?
Sure, sure. So what's interesting is we find a lot of the Native American sites right next to the Chinese sites because they also were working in productive, productive shorelines for mussel and for abalone, whatever other marine products. So they're different artifacts. The Native Americans, they have more stone artifacts out there. We were tripping over stone bowls on a couple of islands. The Chinese artifacts are pretty, you can identify them because you've got the brownwares like I showed you, the opium paraphernalia, that's pretty straightforward. And also the fact that it's adult black abalone. That's the main way that we're able to distinguish that it's Chinese and not Native American. Because we see that the Native Americans are harvesting the abalone, but in a lot of cases they're juveniles. They're not going for the adults. So, okay, yes, sir.
Do you think the populations came into contact with one another? Was there any conflict, signs of conflict on the islands?
Oh, such a good question. Yes, let me tell you. Okay, so I always wondered about that. I always wondered because not only would there be human contact, but there's Native American human remains out there. And I always wondered how did that affect, the way that the Chinese felt about being on the islands. So there was this man in Santa Barbara, his name was J.P. Harrington. Is anyone familiar with him? He was an anthropologist. And so one of my colleagues has been reading those notes, okay? So he left behind a lot of notes. And they're written in all different languages. It's written in Native American dialects. When he's talking about something kind of nasty, he shifts to German. So they're all different languages. So she has found interactions between Chinese and Native Americans. So, but it's not during this period. See, this is another problem with the Harrington Notes is he has these informants, but there's no dates on them. So we're trying to figure out, because we know that the Chinese and the Native Americans are not on the island at the same time when the Native Americans actually living there, because they're taken off in the 1820s. Chinese come 1850s. So we're thinking that perhaps the Native Americans were sent out there to work as ranchers. We're not 100% sure. But the best story is that Native Americans saw Chinese burying their dead out there because there were several people that died out there, and they described it. So it's fantastic. There might be an article coming out. Be aware. Yes.
Was Monterey involved in the abalone industry
Yes.
at the time?
Yes, so Monterey started out as abalone, and then they shifted to squid. So squid was their
But
main
during the
product.
time that the Chinese were here?
Yes, yes. I'll tell you this, you're going to see it in a second. So I want to think, and I need a little more evidence about this is what I think right now, is that I think that the Chinese came here purposely to harvest marine products and that they settled all along the California coast to do that. So they're all here at the same time. In fact, the 1856 account where we have the Chinese on Santa Cruz Island, that vessel was coming from Monterey. So, could be a clan thing, could be a district association. I'm working on that. Okay, any other questions? Yes.
When did the ranchers move on to the sheep and cattle?
Oh, goodness, let me think. So, Santa Rosa Island was gifted from the Carrillo family, I think, to the Carrillo family right around the 1820s, 1830s. They're out there.
So there would be, at the same time, actually.
Oh, yes. The Chinese were leasing the fisheries from the island owners. Yeah, we found some leases for that. And they're also being transported on island vessels. So the people that own the islands, they have their own transport vessels. Chinese are being taken to the islands on those vessels. Yeah. Any other questions? Is it okay? Here we go. Whoop, too fast. Okay. All right. So I've been doing this for a long time. And my fellow archaeologists said, okay, Libby, you can do all of this, but nobody can get the abalone out of California and overseas. So good luck to you, see if you can figure that out. So I thought, okay, I'm going to try to figure that out because it's important. It's an important part of the story. So what I did for my thesis is I came up with some research questions, which are how did the Chinese merchants in Santa Barbara, remember this is all taking place out of Santa Barbara's Chinese community, how did they establish the Trans-Pacific Trade Network, who were the trading partners, and who benefited from the industry, okay? So those are my questions, and I thought, okay, now how am I gonna, I need a framework, I need something to hang all of this on. So I found this trading diaspora framework, which fits perfectly, turns out it fits perfectly. So the trading diaspora asks these questions. So merchants would form a cohesive group to control most aspects of trade for specific commodities. Now this is just a general framework. Groups organized around a recognized authority figure with links to individuals in the same group. Members of the trading group settle in transportation centers along the trade route and manage and maintain exchange. And the group maintains a separate cultural identity from the host community. So this is what I was working with. So I was working with the research questions using the diaspora, the trading diaspora, as my framework. So here's the methods that I used to figure all this out, is that I conducted research at the National Archives, the Huntington Library, UCLA, Santa Barbara Historical Society, and Chinese Historical Society of Southern California, cataloged and analyzed immigration and partnership files, compiled a database of abalone export figures, which came from the Huntington Library, and consulted census data and historical newspaper databases. So I've been collecting newspaper accounts for 25 years. I have one database for Ventura, I have one database for Oxnard, and one database for the Channel Islands. So this helps to fill in all the gaps. Okay, now we're going to move to Santa Barbara. Okay, so we know that the trade was taking place from Santa Barbara. So Santa Barbara's Chinese community was on Canyon Perdido Street between State and Anacapa, the first Chinese community. It moved up a block up in the 1920s. And it was built around the 1870s or so. And there were 4 companies that I know of that were involved with the abalone and fishery industry. There was Sing Chung and Company, Sun Lung and Company, Yuki Company, and hang on, one more, Sing Hop Company. Now, Sing Chung and Company and Sing Hop Company were in this adobe, in the Elizalde adobe. And that's where they did business for almost 60 years. They were harvesting abalone. So this is a fantastic map. I found this in the National Archives. It's a map from 1894, where immigration was under customs at that time, came into Santa Barbara and drew this hand-drawn map about everybody who was in town at that time in 1894. So we have one for Santa Barbara, we have one for Ventura, and I know there's one for San Diego as well. So that's a treasure, huh? Okay, so after looking at all of that, after analyzing all of that material and going to all those different areas, I found out that the Chinese in Santa Barbara came from Zhongshan area. So that is right here near Macau, okay? And that is an area where they were fishermen. They were known to be fishermen and agriculturalists as well. It was also the home of Sun Yat-sen, the first president of the Republic of China. It was renamed in 1925. As we know, Macau was a Portuguese port. So the people in this district were exposed to maritime trade because they were so close to Macau. So they had exposure to influences of overseas merchants, Western customs, technology, and the desire to earn money to support their families, which led them to leave here and then go overseas. So it's a pretty important area for the Chinese to come from. So the people from Zhongshan went to areas such as Southeast Asia, Australia, the Hawaiian Islands, and the Americas. And this is one of the villages. That's the Aoyang village. So Aoyang is also a surname of Chinese fishermen. So here's some more pictures of Chinese merchants that were in Santa Barbara. So we just talked about the 4 companies. So a large percentage, like we said, were from the Soon clan, okay? So here we have Soon Chung Sing, Soon Joe, and Soon Boy. Of course, we believe they're all from the same district. The Soons are from that district. So what they did is that they set up partnerships. Now remember when we said that only merchants were allowed to bring in their families? They set up these partnerships with merchants, so they were allowed to stay here, they were allowed to bring their families here. So it was kind of a little loophole in the law. So they had partners in Santa Barbara, some had partners in San Francisco as well as in China. So they had these trading partners. So this type of a network was known as Gold Mountain Traders, where they shipped goods, they shipped money, remittances, and they also shipped human remains back to China. So the tradition for the Chinese is that if you die here, you need to have your remains sent back to your village, back in the homeland. So there were these specialists that would go around to the Chinese cemeteries and disinter the people that died here and then ship them back. So this network helped with that. They also helped people to immigrate here to America. So one other thing that they did here in the Sun Mining Company is that they hired European Americans to help them. They had lawyers, they had European American lawyers, they had a pharmacist who would write letters to the island owners and to any like legal people that they needed to talk to, because they had all this legal stuff going on. Because if they wanted to go to China in return, they had to start this whole process to be evaluated. And they were also, as you saw, by customs officials coming into town, they were monitored. They're constantly monitored. Okay. So we talked about how there needed to be an authority figure. So the most outspoken and visible fishery merchant was Soon Chung Sing. I think he was in the newspaper every week. It's amazing. He would say, I'm such a fantastic businessman. You know, I have all of these vessels. At one point, he either owned or contracted 6 Chinese junks. He would talk about how he has crews that are working for him. He goes to the islands. He was pretty much established as an authority figure, both in the host community and by his community as well. He exported fish and seaweed. He purchased marine products from the European Americans. He leased land in Santa Barbara for farming and bricklaying. He was just very successful. So in 1898, now this is a little excerpt from an immigration file. This man right here, who was a district attorney at the time, said that he had known Sing Chung. So just so you know, is that when Chinese people are talked about in the newspaper, they didn't give their full name. So his full name was Soon Chung Sing, but they always refer to them by their store name. That's something you have to remember, and that's what makes it difficult to track these people as well. So he said he's a prominent merchant in the city of Santa Barbara. He's been largely interested in speculation in Santa Barbara. He has rented lands, farmed on large areas with his agents, and conducted business in a wholesale manner. He's considered good for all of his contracts. He's considered one of the most reliable Chinese residents in the city of Santa Barbara. That's saying a lot during this time period. This is during the exclusion period, 1898. So he has established his authority. Okay, so here's how the network worked, is that the abalone would come off of the islands, or the marine products would come off the islands, and they'd be stored. I have all these reports that they'd be stored in warehouses there at the wharf. And then they would be picked up by Pacific Coast Steamship Company. And here, this gives you an idea of some of the yield that was picked up in 1888 and transported to San Francisco on the Pacific Steamship Company. Now this is a low year, because what happens with the shells, you can see that they've broken out the shell price and the dried meat, is that the price of shell fluctuated over time. So there were some periods where it wasn't popular, that it would just be left on the islands, kind of like a warehouse on the islands, and then when the price would go back up, they'd go out and harvest them. So the Senator, which is here, is one of the vessels that was part of the Pacific Steamship Company. And then here's the route here. Okay, so down here from San Diego up to San Francisco, all the way, they went all the way into Washington. You see these stars here? That is where the Chinese work in the fisheries. So it's all along the route. You can see that there. Okay, and then once it got to San Francisco, there were all kinds of Chinese commission agents up there in San Francisco that between 1850 and 1880, China was San Francisco's third largest trading partner, and part of it had to do with the marine products that were coming out of California. So to accommodate this trade, the Pacific Mail Steamship Company started the Trans-Pacific service between San Francisco, Japan, and China in 1867. So they're going to Hong Kong. They also transported people, so they had people and products. And then, because the business was so good, the Oriental and Occidental Steamship Company started in 1875, which did this pretty much the same route. And that was started by the big four railroad builders, Crocker, Stanford, Huntington, and Hopkins. So they started their own steamship company. These guys are busy, really busy. So what you see here is just what Sing China Company shipped in these 2 years here, 1884 and 1885. So you can see that he's using both lines, and he's shipping all of this. Now I have evidence that he actually, in one case, loaded one of his junks and took it up to San Francisco, loaded full of marine products. So it's a going venture. So the other really interesting thing is that these Pacific Mail Steamship Company records are in the Huntington, and apparently people haven't seen them since like the 1940s when they arrived at the Huntington Library. So I just, I knew that they had the collection. I kind of hoped that I could find, the Chinese fishing products moving around. So I was able to find it. So I have it not only for, I have the files, the information for abalone and squid as well. And shrimp. Shrimp, big export, huge export. So once it gets over to China, the money is used for the welfare of the families. So we know that the Chinese fishermen's families are there, their wives are there, their children are there, and the money, the remittances are used to help out the families. So what they would do with the money is that once the family needs were pretty much provided for, they would invest in buildings, they would repair houses, they would help brothers to get married, they would contribute to the purchase of land, and they'd lend money to people. And then when it got really good, because these villages are pretty rich, because they have all this money coming in from overseas. So when even more money started to come in, they would use the money to improve the village infrastructure. They would build health clinics, schools, street lights, community buildings, watchtowers, because there's so much wealth here, there were bandits that would come and try to take some of that wealth. So we pretty much proved the whole trading diaspora by finding that there is a cohesive group of merchants that control the Trans-Pacific trade. We have a recognized authority figure. We have trading partners that were comprised of either clan members, like in this case the Soong clan that came from Zhongshan. We know that they were Gold Mountain traders. We know that there were partners that were established along the transportation routes and in China, and that the money that came there benefited the families. So the fishing industry declines over time, and this is the process of decline. So just as the Chinese are discriminated against as a whole, they're also discriminated against in the fisheries. So in 1870, the Chinese fishermen were accused of depleting the fisheries. 1893, Congress specifically defined persons engaged in taking or drying or otherwise preserving abalone meat, shells, or fish for home consumption or exportation as laborers. As such, they fall under the terms of the Act. So what happened is that the first Chinese Exclusion Act, 1882, was for 10 years. It renews 1892 with the Gary Act. 1893, they start redefining laborer. So now all of a sudden, fishermen were fined for 10 years. After 1893, they're laborers. So it makes it more difficult for them to go to China and return. So in 1900s, early 1900s, Chinese were accused of depleting abalone populations, County ordinances were passed after 1900 that restricted intertidal collection of abalone, size restrictions, and closed seasons were put into place. And then, of course, in 1913, the export of dried abalone was completely prohibited. And by 1914, Sun Milling Company is no longer in Santa Barbara. So they completely killed the industry. So for future directions, things, because I'm not done yet, I've got more work to do here, is that we need to continue to the documentation of Chinese abalone harvesting sites on Channel Islands. We will make it to Catalina. We need to conduct interviews with descendants of Chinese merchants and fishermen involved in the abalone industry. I have interviewed shrimp fishermen, no abalone fishermen yet. Visit the home villages to document the developments fostered by the remittances that came from California. Identify and translate Chinese language sources. This is a tough one, but I'm working on it. And continue research and interpretation of the abalone yield data and historical trans-Pacific export records. So lots of work. I think I'm going to do this my whole life. And here's my acknowledgments. The end. Any questions? Yes.
Yeah, I remember the one screen that showed the value of it for the shells also. Was that mostly for like jewelry making?
Yeah, jewelry making, buttons, big button industry, those little curios. You've ever seen those little curio things? They would put them like on handles of like forks and serving spoons. Yeah, it's a big industry. Yeah.
Seems like you become an expert on immigration policy back in those days.
It's complicated, but you have to be able to follow it because you can see it affects the industry. Also, the Japanese come around 1899, 1900, and that adds a whole other layer of the abalone depletion. But the Japanese dove for abalone. They didn't take the black intertidal. They don't.
I know that the early farmers here, like Xavier's, brought Japanese cooks from Gold Country when they moved down here in the 1860s and 70s.
Japanese here in the 1860s
Yes,
or
right there,
70s.
Japanese working for it.
Okay. Well, that would have been kind of a one-off because the major migration of Japanese coming is like 1890, like in Oxnard, we start to see them there. In the fisheries, we start to see them there. Yeah.
I get it.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay, so still kind of back to my first thing, which is about the processing. We don't have FedEx overnight delivery to China. Even sending a ship to San Francisco is one. So if we're dealing with dried abalone meat, I mean, what's the life expectancy of that, and how do you get it to China in good shape?
Oh, that's an excellent question. So apparently the consistency of it is like shoe leather, okay? Because there's all these newspaper accounts where Euro-Americans are saying, they're out there taking our abalone, but we don't know how to cook it, we don't know how to eat it, it's like shoe leather, so they're completely out of the industry until like 1910 or so. So from what I can tell, based on the export pattern of this, is it looks like they'd go out there for about 3 months, looks like they would stockpile it for a short period of time in Santa Barbara, put it on those vessels that have a regular schedule going up to San Francisco. And then after Oriental and Occidental steamship comes in, there's lots of travel between San Francisco and China. So I think it's happening pretty quickly. As far as how long it lasts, I don't know. I'm gonna have to find out.
Long enough, I would guess, but
Yeah, because it's rock hard. It's dry. Yes.
Is there an abalone industry today? I thought they ran out of abalone.
Yeah, it's endangered, especially the black. But the good news is that the last time I was on Santa Cruz, 2015, it's recovering. We actually saw black abalone there in the intertidal. So it's working. It's going to be a while, before they allow them to take them again. Yeah. Any other questions? No? Okay, thank you very much.